Hi, I'm Roni. I wrote this story. It's set in Syria in the Middle East. It's called Taken Hostage. Determined to get an early start, I was on the road at the crack of dawn, hitchhiking out of Homs, Syria's third largest city. The destination of the day was the impressive Krak de Chevaliers, set majestically atop a hill just north of the Lebanese border. An isolated medieval fortress in the middle of nowhere, it was just the kind of place I like to visit. As the sun rose over the horizon, I stuck my thumb out on the highway, waiting for a ride. In the 90s, I used to be able to claim that I'd never been in a country where I hadn't hitchhiked. It wasn't about the bus fare. It was the feeling I got on the side of the road while thumbing down a vehicle. Many cars passed without a glance in my direction. That was okay with me. The right car, the right driver, usually came along at exactly the right time. It was about the adventure of traveling, the journey, and the people I met along the way. Hitchhiking was one of the best ways to meet local people. So there I was, on the verge of a highway, bombing a lift. "Where you go?" asked a policeman in a dark uniform as he pulled up. "Krak de Chevaliers." "I go Snoon, you come." Limited English was never an obstacle. I climbed into the police car and we headed down the road towards Snoon. Over the next 25 minutes, I learned that Karam was going home to his family after a long night shift in the city. He had 4 children, one of whom had just started high school. He was worried for her future. She wanted to study fine arts in Damascus, and he didn't know if he would be able to afford the university fees. The other issue was his wife. "She want Amira marry," he said wistfully, "not go school." "Amira can do both," I said, sure his daughter would be fine. At the turnoff to Snoon, Karam dropped me off, but not before flagging down a private charter bus and instructing the chauffeur to give me a ride to Talkalak. The driver could hardly defy a man in a police uniform. The bus was going to Tarsus. "Talkalak, turn there," Karam told me. The turnoff was just past Talkalak. The road to the castle travelled a wiggly route around the edge of the Gap of Homs. There was a longer way round on Highway 43 that would have been a lot more scenic, but I wanted to be in Tarsus on the Mediterranean coast by evening. Sensitive to Middle Eastern culture, I was dressed in long pants and a long-sleeved shirt. There was a headscarf in my pack that I usually used when I visited mosques. Though exposed, my hair was tied neatly back for the journey. 29 pairs of smouldering black eyes pierced the back of my skull for 25 minutes as I sat on the floor at the top of the steps for the ride to the turnoff. Not a soul on the bus spoke a word of English. Sadly, it was impossible to strike up a conversation with men who stared silently, their faces stone masks of intensity. It was impossible to tell if it was their disbelief at a female hitchhiker, their disapproval of a woman not wearing a headscarf, or resentment that they were forced to pick me up. For 25 long minutes, the tension was so tangible it could have been strummed. I sat like a statue with my eyes focused intently on the road that ran alongside Lebanon's northern frontier. Relieved to be off the bus, I smiled and waved as it rumbled away. One man in the back grinned and waved out the window as the bus disappeared. In the hot sun, I waited at the turnoff. From my backpack, I took a sarong to wrap around my head and shoulders as shade, the novel I was reading, and the bag of food I packed in Homs the night before. I also carried plenty of drinking water in case I got stuck anywhere for too long. Unpacking the falafel I bought from a street vendor the previous night, I sat on my tightly stuffed backpack and tucked into the thick pita bread, damp with garlic yogurt and chili sauces. There was no traffic in any direction. A while later, as I popped sweet fresh dates and juicy ripe figs into my mouth, I wondered if I was on the right road. Had there been some miscommunication between Karam and the bus driver? There weren't any other roads to turn off onto. I had to convince myself I was going in the right direction in the middle of a country I knew little about. I didn't speak more than 5 words of the language, was no longer in possession of the map I bought in Damascus, and was travelling alone and by the seat of my pants. An hour passed before a rusting red tip truck pulled up. "Khaled al-Hasnan?" asked the driver. Fortunately, I'd heard the Arabic word for Krak de Chevaliers enough times to recognise it. "Naam," I replied, nodding assent and smiling, adding shukran to express my thanks. I climbed up into the cab and sat beside his wife and 2 children. These generous people also didn't speak a word of English, but that was no obstacle for the 2 little boys. "Esmi Roni," I introduced myself. "Esmi Haddad." "Esmi Mahdi," shouted the boys. Haddad and Mahdi played hide and seek with me, hiding behind our hands and yelling boo whenever we revealed our faces. The little boys squealed with delight, and the 3 of us laughed and played for the 20-minute journey. The boy's mother smiled and patted my back as I descended the cab at the base of the castle. "Elhamdulillah," intoned the driver as I got down, reciting a simple prayer. "Shukran, shukran, shukran," I replied, my hands clasped at my chest and my head bowed. The whole family waved out the window, calling out in Arabic and laughing raucously as the truck rolled down the dusty road. A World Heritage Site, Krak de Chevaliers, or Knight's Fortress, was once described by British archaeologist Thomas Edward Lawrence as the best preserved castle in the world. Never before had it been so effortless to travel back in time and land squarely in the 11th century. While the Hellenistic city of Argh was nominated to serve as the military headquarters of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, the Krak de Chevaliers became their most formidable bastion. This tremendous fortress, the largest medieval castle in the Middle East, was built by the Kurds and later rebuilt by the Crusaders, survived the Middle Ages in remarkably good condition. The castle preserves some of Christianity's most important artwork, artefacts and relics from the Crusade period that can be found in the Middle East. The Kurdish Emir of Homs built the first fortification at this site in 1031. It was called Hisn al-Akrad, Castle of the Kurds, and housed a garrison of Kurdish soldiers. The original castle was much smaller, consisting of a single enclosure, the walls of which correspond with the present inner ward. During the First Crusade in 1099, it was captured by Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, aka Raymond de St. Gilles. The Count abandoned the castle after only 10 days of occupation, leaving to march on Jerusalem. It was retaken by Tancred, Prince of Galilee, the following year. In 1142, it was gifted to Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, and then handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, who redesigned and fortified the castle to create a starting point from which to launch fresh campaigns. Renovations included a bakery, a refectory, warehouses, latrines, 2 large halls, and a chapel in the French Gothic style, which later became a mosque. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the fortress was damaged by a series of earthquakes and subsequently repaired, becoming increasingly stronger with each reconstruction. Mameluke Sultan Baibars conducted a month-long siege on Krak de Chevaliers in 1271 and negotiated an honourable surrender from its occupants. The knights were granted safe passage to Tripoli. Baibars restored the walls and added 2 towers to its southwestern side. In 1285, Sultan al-Mansur Qalawun built the square tower in the outer southern wall. Krak de Chevaliers was used until it was abandoned at the beginning of the 19th century. Decades later, the locals built a small village inside the castle. It was bought by France in 1927. They removed the village and restored the castle before donating it to Syria in 1947. First through the gates in the morning, I had the whole castle to myself for several hours. It was easy to be blown away by Krak de Chevaliers. Gusty winds howling over the hill were strong enough to make walking around the historic site a battle in itself. Donning a sweater to visit the ramparts, I was careful not to be swept across the plains on the powerful breeze. Enthralled, I explored the castle from top to bottom, inspecting limestone brickworks, admiring the lintels, venturing into halls and rooms which had once been vibrant with life. I could picture the knights slurping hot soup from wooden bowls at a long table in the dining room. In the dark dungeons, I could almost hear the wails of the prisoners. Fending off hunger for as long as I could by munching on dates and figs, as I thirstily drank in the history of the magnificent castle, I stretched out my visit for as long as possible. Just after noon, when a busload of gabbling tourists arrived at the main gate, it was time to leave. Once again, I sat at the roadside and waited for a ride back to the turnoff. My position just south of the main gate offered little shade. Fortunately, I wasn't there long. A friendly man in a delivery van gave me a ride on his way back to Homs. Uncertain it was okay to leave me in the middle of nowhere, he nervously waved goodbye as he left me alone on the side of the road. His fear was unfounded. I sat on my pack and read to pass the time. A few days on the coast at the 4,000-year-old city of Tarsus was next on my to-do list. Originally, it was founded as a Phoenician colony of Argh. There's something about ancient remains that gives me a good perspective of my place in the world. I have been alive less than 0.5% of the time Tarsus has been in existence. Peppered with remnants of the Crusader invasion, the second largest port city in Syria promised a combination of relaxing beach time and rich history lessons. I just had to get there. It was 55 kilometres. Less than half an hour passed when a white minivan pulled up. "Where are you going?" asked a young man with good English. "Tartus," I said, wondering if they could take me that far. He leaned back and discussed this with the other passengers for a moment. Then the side door slid open and several hands waved me inside. "We're going to Tartus," said the young man. "We'll take you." "Thank you, I appreciate it." We made introductions and they established I was the first person from Tasmania they'd ever met. Fascinated, they asked me endless questions. Several of the group of 3 men and 3 women spoke English and translated to the front passenger who didn't. It wasn't long before I learned they were members of one family. They lived in Tarsus and had been visiting older family members in Homs for a few days. They permitted me to join them for their journey home. "Are you hungry?" asked one of the sisters. "Yes, a little," I confessed, having consumed all my food. "We're going to stop for lunch. It's a famous place for barbecues," said the friendly young man. "We always stop here on our way home from Homs," added the elder sister, giggling. The van turned off the main highway towards Al Hamidiyah and bumped over a rough road for 15 minutes. Arid terrain stretched out in all directions. Western Syria isn't green. When we arrived at the car park, everyone got out and stretched, some loudly yawning before leaning down to touch their toes. "It's not a long drive, but we didn't get much sleep last night," explained the oldest brother. A massive tent structure made from what appeared to be recycled big top with cement foundations and ornate gates covered in vines loomed above as we entered the cavernous restaurant. 30 tables were set out in straight lines, each able to seat a party of 10 or 12. The place was buzzing. Waiters ran to and fro, taking orders for food and drinks, delivering large trays of steaming meat, massive bowls of vegetables and salads, tureens of soup, and mountains of bread in woven baskets. A smartly uniformed maitre d' rushed to greet us, shaking hands and chatting pleasantly with the mustachioed van driver, who turned out to be everyone's father. Adnan and his wife Maya followed the man into the dining area, followed by their daughters, Kamar and Zaina, and their sons, Fatih and Said. I trailed behind, curious and excited about what was to come. As we approached the long table, draped in a white linen cloth, several waiters appeared from nowhere and simultaneously pulled out the carved wooden chairs with a flourish. The scene was so surreal. I felt like I had come face to face with the story of Aladdin, his magic lamp, and its famous genie. My wish of a decent meal was about to be granted. "What would you like to eat?" asked Fatih. "Is there a bathroom? I want to wash my hands," I said, secretly thinking about my face, washing my face, my neck, my arms, legs, body, and even my hair after a morning in the dusty Syrian west. A change of clothes wouldn't have gone astray either. Before I could blink, a smiling waiter appeared at my side to guide me to the facilities. Being dressed in rags and treated like royalty felt rather ironic. Chuckling to myself, I stepped into the bathroom. Gleaming white marble adorned with shiny gold fittings surrounded my pauper's body. There was, in fact, a shower in the last stall. It was tempting. Choosing to behave myself and respect my hosts, I restrained the urge to stand naked under fresh running water and washed as much grime from my arms and face as I could before returning to the table. "We have ordered," announced Zaina as I took my seat. "Wonderful. I'm hungry," I replied, smiling. A waiter placed 4 large pitchers of iced water on the table and set a crystal glass in front of each place. Satisfied we could quench our thirst, he picked up the empty tray and ran back to the kitchen. Said immediately took charge and poured drinks for everyone. Between Arabic whispers and English statements, the conversation flowed back and forth. It turned out that the 4 siblings had studied at a language school in London. Over the course of his career as an import-export consultant, Adnan had done business there and had friends with whom he could trust his offspring for a few months. Most of them spoke well, fluently as opposed to accurately. In order of oldest to youngest, they were Fatih, Kamar, Said, and Zaina. Maya understood our banter, but was terrified to speak in case she made a mistake. Heaped platters of food. I lost my spot. Heaped platters of food were brought to the table. From a large family of 7 and accustomed to preparing meals, I couldn't even imagine how 7 adults would be able to eat everything placed in front of us. There would be leftovers for a week. You must try this. Kamar slid a slice of meat from her fork over to my plate. The flavour was familiar and unusual at the same time. I liked it. A roar of approval went up at the table. I had just eaten my first piece of roasted goat. In turn, each member of the family put a morsel on my plate and suggested I try it. From jewelled rice to stuffed vine leaves and eggplant fateh, I sampled the best of Syria's cuisine. Tasty kebab karaz made from lamb meatballs and kaba hamda made with bulgur and pomegranate sauce passed my lips as I dined like royalty with the wonderful family from Tarsus. As we ate, a singer performed on the stage, twirling and whirling in glittering full skirts as she belted out traditional folk songs with her incredible voice. After a dozen songs, she took a break. A few minutes later, a belly dancer appeared, shaking her agile hips to the drum beat in ways most Western women can only imagine. Soon after the dance, an ensemble of 5 men entered the stage holding traditional instruments: oud, kamenja, kanan, darabuka, and duf, which they played and sang as a choir. The entertainment went on for over an hour before muted pipe music filtered through the air in the restaurant once again. "Do you know where you'll stay in Tartus?" asked Adnan, passing over yet another piece of mashi, zucchini stuffed with ground beef, rice and nuts. "No, I haven't figured that out yet," I admitted, digging into the delicious food. Hotels weren't usually planned as I went. It was easy enough to turn up in town and find lodgings. Usually there was some kind of important, unless there was some kind of important cultural event taking place at my destination. Accommodation wasn't something I ever stressed about. There was always a place to stay. "Have some baklava," suggested Saeed, passing the laden tray. When offered hospitality in the Middle East, I had learned to accept with a smile. To refuse can be considered offensive. I had also learned to leave food on my plate to indicate I had eaten enough. To empty the plate was akin to a request for more food. Even though baklava was too sweet for my taste, I took one small piece from the tray and put it on my plate. Eating it was an art form in itself, which required approximately 1 litre of water as an accompaniment just to wash down the sugar. "You, hostage," announced Maya, speaking her first English words all day. I almost spat my mouthful of water onto the table. "What?" "Hostage," she repeated, pointing at her chest and then at me. You, hostage." How does one refuse such an offer, I wondered. Well, it's such a lovely offer, but I really don't think it will fit into my plans, I was tempted to say. Saving us all from a terrible fate, Fatih intervened. "Mama?" he asked, reverting to Arabic to figure out what she was trying to communicate. After a short exchange, the siblings burst into giggles all at once. At this point, I wasn't certain whether there was cause to be alarmed. My usually sharp instincts didn't predict danger. "Host," giggled Saeed. "She wants to say host." "Excuse Mama, she's confused with the words," added Kamar, trying to stop laughing. "She means to say that she would like to host you," explained Zaina. "Sorry," said Maya, blushing fiercely after her children had explained what she'd said. "You must stay with us. Do you agree?" said Zaina, clapping her hands. "Yes, you must," agreed Adnan. You can be our guest for as long as you wish. How could I refuse? Thus, I agreed to be taken hostage by a wonderfully generous and friendly family from Tarsus. There are other videos, so you can watch videos and you can subscribe. And I'll see you next time.